Hi guys, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about housing affordability and jobs, which are major issues here, which is no surprise, major issues everywhere. Everyone wants to have a job for some reason, and then apparently also wants to own homes. How ridiculous is that? Bizarre. So we're going to go through those issues now. We've put them up as separate slides because we think there's a lot of still scope to have them as separate debates, but from the perspective of a discussion, we saw overlap, so we're going to do those things together. So you want to do jobs first? You want to do housing first?
Let's start with housing, and we might wrap up with jobs at the end, because I think the slide really covers, gives you good links to a lot of stuff, but we'll quickly kind of run through it. But housing is probably worth a bit more discussion than we could get on the slide. So let's just do a quick bit of context. Historically in Australia, from the sort of 1950s onwards, the model was that everybody bought their own home, and the dream, and sort of the Australian dream, is to own your own house on a quarter-acre block in the suburbs with enough...
Build it yourself.
And build it yourself with your own two hands, and have a backyard for the kids to play in, and for the wife to grow some veggies in. That's the ideal, with a car parked out the front that your neighbour's secretly jealous of because it's better than his car. That's the kind of ideal. Obviously, over time, that sort of changed as Australia's become a more urban society and people want to live closer to the major cities, and apartment living and all these things have come in. But still, fundamentally, there is this idea in Australia that owning your own home is the goal, and it's one of the signs that you have become a mature, full functioning adult. You've moved out of home, you've bought your own home, you've got married, you've had a couple of kids, you're now a well functioning adult. You've ticked all the boxes. But that's becoming increasingly hard to do, and the progression that used to be in Australia was you lived at home while you were studying, and then as you got your first real jobs, first full-time jobs, you moved out and rented, often with a couple of friends to make it cheap, while you saved up a deposit. You use that deposit to take out a mortgage on a home. You move into your own home, and then for the rest of your life, you just keep trading up to better and better houses. You get a really big house when you're having your family, and then you might shrink down to a smaller house when you retire. And you use that property as the main source of your wealth. So when you want to retire, you sell your big family home, you buy something much smaller, and you use that, the money that you generated from that to fund your retirement, along with your pension and other things. But that home is the critical economic asset. You use your home to borrow money to send your kids to university. You use your home to finance a car if you need one, or to start a business. The home is the central asset that the vast majority of people own who aren't sort of stupidly rich. But what we've seen in Australia in the last sort of 10 or 15 years is rates of home ownership across the board in every age demographic, including older Australians, is declining. So it was at a peak of around 75% of all Australians owning their own home in their lifetime. It's now down into the 60s, and it's heading for the 50s. And so we're pretty quickly going to get to a point on the current trends where a majority of Australians don't own their own home, which will be the first time that's been the case since sort of World War II. So what does that mean? Is that a problem? Should we care about that? And if we do care about it, what should we do about it?
Yeah. And before we get into that, part of why that is happening, is it just because it's getting really expensive? Is it just population, not enough supply of homes, too many Chinese coming in and buying homes?
Again, Google Pauline Hanson, Chinese. Funny things will happen. So yes, it's all of the above. Australia's had massive population growth in the last decade. Big migration from all around the world, but also just the Australian population is growing pretty rapidly too. We've had 20 years of uninterrupted economic growth. Even during the global financial crisis, Australia didn't go into recession. So sentiment in Australia is good. People want to come and live in Australia. It's very stable. It's very prosperous. So huge immigration flows as well. And that does mean that there's a lot of pressure for housing. And at the same time, demographics have changed. So the average household size in Australia is now, much smaller. It used to be, mum and dad and 2.1 kids and a dog. But now increasingly people are living more separately. There's more, 1 and 2 person households. Kids are skipping that step of, renting with their friends and going straight to living on their own or living with their partners. So we need more housing for the same number of people, but also we've got a lot more people. So that's kind of turning things over pretty quickly. But also there's a debate about whether or not the sort of policy settings in Australia are encouraging or discouraging people from owning their own homes.
And that's the interesting bit about negative gearing and how we manage capital returns and stuff.
Yep.
Which would have made a difference with this election. So I still got my fingers crossed. I think it may happen. you want to just give a quick overview of negative gearing?
Yeah, so negative gearing is a really interesting idea, which, to be clear, doesn't just apply to housing in Australia. Negative gearing is such a weird phrase because it applies to any asset class. You can theoretically, under the Australian tax law, negatively gear just about anything at all. But obviously, housing is a special case because of what we said before. It's so important, it's so central to the way people live and plan their finances. So what negatively gearing basically means is that if you have a property you don't live in, an investment property, if you're theoretically losing money on that, so if the rent you're charging people to live in that house is less than the mortgage payments you have to make to pay off the house, then you are negatively geared. Geared just means in debt. Geared means you borrowed. So if you've negatively geared, it means you've borrowed more than you're returning. And that gap between what people are paying you in rent and what you're paying on the mortgage, you can write off as a tax deduction. And if you're in a high income bracket, that tax deduction can be worth more to you than having people pay the amount of rent required to pay off the mortgage. So that's very complicated, and you might need an accounting degree to figure it all out. But put it this way, negative gearing is a bit of a tax dodge. It's a loophole, and if you set up your structures right, you actually have an incentive to set up the rent specifically so you can negatively gear it. And it means that, in theory, the good news about that is that rents are cheaper because landlords have a reason to keep rental prices low. But on the downside, it means that people who have the ability to invest in property get a financial return on that, which encourages them to invest in more and more and more property. So a smaller and smaller number of people are owning a larger and larger share of property. And some people think that's a problem, and that's the debate.
Yeah, and it's an interesting aspect or component of it, because the debate isn't just we want everybody to buy homes, because may not entirely be a good thing. If you over encourage home ownership, that leads to people who really maybe don't need to own homes, can't afford to own homes, owning homes, and then you have the subprime crisis type stuff that happened in the States. But you also, to increase the supply of homes, need people who are willing to spend money on homes. And if you technically do have many people owning homes and a really strong set of legislation that protect renters, that could be good for young people or people who like to move around or look for jobs in places where jobs are, because you're not tied down to your home or have all your property or your wealth sunk in one specific asset, a very rich and expensive asset, which is your home. And that's the broader aspect of the debate, and asking questions like whether or not people actually need to have homes. And if you don't want to encourage people to have homes, or don't want to encourage, just recognize the fact that not everybody needs to have a home or should be pushed into buying homes, then the alternative to that is protecting renters or encouraging a strong rental market.
So let's look at the two broad models that you can have kind of in the housing debate. And these all play out in the Australian debate, but also in lots of other contexts internationally. So you've got the one model that I kind of described at the start, the sort of traditional home ownership model, where the norm is for people to own their own home and really to kind of trade up to better and better homes over the course of their life, and that's predicated on the idea that owning your own home is important, but also that it gives people a very important asset, because housing in Australia is a very safe asset. Traditionally, a home is the best investment you can have. Every financial advisor would say if you've got a mortgage, the best thing you can do is pay that mortgage off as quickly as possible. There's really nothing else you can spend your money on that will generate you such safe and significant returns. So having a house is a really big deal, but that means you have to have a system where you can provide enough supply of housing, and not just the availability of housing, but the location of housing becomes very specific too. Because if people are going to want to own their own homes, they're going to want their own land, they're going to want their own security. That's hard to do. People much prefer to own their own freestanding home than live in apartments, even though more and more people like apartments. Still, the sort of traditional home model is the popular one. That means that the distance, the area of land covered by housing kind of grows and grows, and those people who are living further away from the major cities are living further away from jobs and educational opportunities and all the other things that go along with that.
And has implications for debates around infrastructure or the environment.
Yeah. That's right.
Internet access.
That's right. And so the alternative model is in places like Germany or even New York, where renting is the norm and very few people actually own their own homes. But the way that is kind of balanced out is that renters have very strong rights and protections. So if you rent a home in Germany, you can make a lot of modifications to your home. You can paint the walls a different color. You can bring your own kitchen, set up in. You can make all kind of changes. You can have pets. You can do all sorts of fun stuff. And you have long, secure rental agreements. So it's very hard for a landlord to just decide that they want to kick you out and have someone come in who might be prepared to pay more money. And that security really lets you, plan your life and decide where you want to work and where your kids want to go to school and all those things which are heavily dependent on where you live. So you can have a model where houses are a key asset, but there's some downsides to that in terms of infrastructure and the environment and the ability for people to be able to afford that. Or you can have a rental model where people don't have that asset, but they're not taking on all that debt that you get when you buy a house, so they've got money kind of free to invest in other things, which might provide them the same kind of security. But you have to really pick which model it is. Are we going to encourage home ownership and have protections and incentives around that? Or are we going to encourage renting and have the kind of culture and the law and the protections that go with that to make that practical? In places like Australia at the moment, arguably, we don't really have either. We've got a diminishing number of people who can afford to own their own home, but renters have very, very few rights in Australia, and it's a very insecure way to live for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think that's broadly around most parts of Asia as well. It's just the big distinction is with Europe versus the rest of the world. But I think that's a nice segue to move into talking about the economy and jobs, because that has a huge implication on the economy and vice versa. In regards to the impact on housing.
So Australia's a funny place, right? In a lot of respects, our economy's pretty great by global standards. As I said, we've not been in a recession at any time in the lifetime of most people who are going to debate at AustralAsians. They've never lived through a recession. The best they've ever lived through, or the worst they've ever lived through, really is the global financial crisis when growth slowed in Australia and investment slowed in Australia, but still it was very strong. So we're a very prosperous country. Overall, unemployment's pretty low in Australia, but having said all of that, there are still some really significant issues, and Australia's a very big place. Significant numbers of people live in small kind of rural areas, and in particular in some of those places kind of further away from the main cities, there are pockets of very high unemployment. There are places even relatively close to the cities that are historically poor and disadvantaged communities, which have not only higher than average unemployment, but have kind of cycles of poverty that go along with unemployment, that have been that way for decades and decades. So there's always a big debate in Australia, about jobs and the economy, and how do we keep kind of producing not just the total number of jobs we need in the economy, but the kinds of jobs we need to support people who live in those places that haven't done as well historically. And in this election, that's been no different. But the change in context has been, on the back of that sort of normal trend, there have been some really important recent decisions which have really put some communities under pressure. And the really big one is the end of the automotive industry. So there's something like 17 countries in the world that have a serious automotive industry, where Malaysia's one. And in all of those countries, there are heavy government subsidies and support to maintain industry. It's a very competitive industry, and every country that has that industry is supporting their industry, and so every other country has to also support their industry so that everybody can compete. And Australia was no different. We paid big subsidies to 2 or 3 big car companies to manufacture cars here. And the reason why that was seen as so important is because manufacturing provides really well-paid jobs to people who are relatively low skilled. So it's not an unskilled job, but you don't need high-level tertiary qualifications to be an automotive worker, but you'll get a higher than average income, and the kind of income that you can comfortably raise a family on. So protecting those jobs for a very long time was seen as very strategically important to Australia to have that capacity, but also socially very important to have people of that demographic having those kind of really excellent well-paid, well-protected jobs. But last year the federal government made a decision to stop the subsidies to the car companies, and unsurprisingly, pretty much overnight, they all said, thanks very much, we're going to shut down. And so over the next 2 or 3 years, they're all going to shut their productions. And there are some estimates that there are tens of thousands of people directly or indirectly employed because of the automotive industry, and those people are going to lose their jobs.
Yep. And it's an interesting kind of cycle. Like we're in this situation in Malaysia as well, and it's not just automotive. I think it's any kind of large scale manufacturing. Yeah. It's difficult for those industries to sustain on their own, because you need the infrastructure support, you need the training, you need the whole ecosystem for that to function. You need to get preferential tariffs. You need all of these things for that to work. And on its own, it really can't. And it's become a type of thing that is mobile now. Companies and companies can move pretty quickly. Actually, it takes a long time for them to set up and invest. But when they decide they don't want to move anymore, in a couple of years you can pick up and move somewhere else, because many of the other countries have the basic level of infrastructure, which doesn't take a lot for you to scale up or to scale down back again. So so that's interesting. Do you think we've moved post manufacturing? That's the whole. We're supposed to be a high level services industry now. This is the economy of the future.
Well, this is a debate. So Australia for a long time has been moving towards more of a sort of service economy, and a lot of people have seen that as being a really good thing, because services are very resilient as sectors, because people always need to eat. So restaurants and cafes and things will do well, and people who provide services to you to make your life easier. As long as the economy is doing well, those businesses are going to do well. But I guess the challenge is two things. What we talked about before, having manufacturing means people who are relatively, low or moderately skilled can have really well paid, well protected, kind of unionized jobs. You can't really get that sort of paying conditions in the service sector if you have that level of education. But I guess the second thing is from the overall economic perspective, it's important that countries have things to export. And if you're not exporting, roughly in balance with the amounts that you're importing, that can have really significant impacts on your economy. So in Australia, a lot of the services industries are very domestically focused. It's about companies providing for local demand. One example of an exception to that, though, is international education. So international education is the largest service sector in Victoria, which is the state that we're sitting in right now.
We are the education state.
We are the education state. So that's a big sector where lots of international students are coming into Australia to study, and that's counted technically as an export. So services can provide that sort of export. But they do struggle to provide the same kind of quality of jobs and employment conditions that you get in manufacturing. So there still is significant manufacturing in Australia, but how long can it survive without the automotive industry to sort of underpin it? Nobody knows for sure, but a lot of people are very concerned.
And is the mining boom definitely over?
The mining boom is over. It was short and sweet, particularly if you lived in Western Australia, where most of the mining happened. It was great. But the rivers of gold seem to have dried up on that, and now in Australia we're talking about an ideas boom, which some people might uncharitably think is a much easier boom to talk about than it is to deliver. But it's not clear kind of where the next big kind of engine of growth will come from. In the slides we gave you, we've given you some links to how the two major political parties have sort of made their pitches about where economic growth and jobs are going to come from. Everything from renewable energy, through to agriculture and all sorts of other sectors that have potential for growth in Australia. But putting that all together in a plan which provides jobs of the right quality in the places where they're most desperately needed is a very, very difficult thing to do.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting aspect of the whole jobs creation or economic sustainability debate that's often missed, but has come up, and that's the quality of jobs.
Yeah.
You need permanent jobs, or you need jobs that give security or stability. There was this, I think, the debate also around 0-hour contracts and all the stuff that happened in Europe. So it's not just whether you're creating the jobs, the type of jobs that we're creating, and then the implications that has on other things. So the ability of people to move, the ability of people to invest, the ability of people to buy homes, etc.
Yeah. So, for example, one thing you might want to look up is Australia has globally speaking a very high minimum wage, and that's very good for the kind of quality of jobs argument. But some people say it's very bad for the kind of quantity of jobs argument, that there are people who are priced out of the market, and that might particularly impact on those areas where unemployment is highest. So, how do you get that balance right between wanting to make sure that employment really provides for people so they can buy homes and look after their families? But how do you also make sure that we create enough jobs in the right places at the right times for people who need them? Very difficult balance.
Excellent. I think we've covered all we wanted to cover for this issue.
If you've got questions, please post them on our Facebook page. We'll do our very best to help you out. If you're posting about a job, we can't help you with that, but we can help you with ideas about how governments can create jobs.
Or maybe we can help push your posting around. If you're trying to hire someone, you know, if you've got a good idea.
If you need 2 former debate coaches to work for you, then you should definitely post and tell us about that. That'd be great.
Yeah, we work for our rates are ridiculously cheap.
So ridiculous.
Have fun, guys. Take care.
See ya.